The first time I noticed my shadow was walking home before me. I thought it was a trick of the streetlights. It was late October, and I had stayed at work longer than usual. By the time I left the office, it was almost 11 at night. The neighborhood was quiet, the sidewalks were empty, and a cold wind pushed dry leaves across the pavement. I lived about 15 minutes away, so I put my hands in my jacket pockets and started walking home. Everything felt normal until I passed the old pharmacy on Miller Street. That's when I saw my shadow stretch across the sidewalk in front of me. It looked completely normal at first. My head, my shoulders, my arms. But then I noticed something strange. I was still standing still, yet my shadow kept moving. I stopped immediately. The shadow stopped too, but not at the same time. There was a tiny delay, maybe half a second, like someone was controlling it from somewhere else. I raised my right hand. The shadow raised its right hand. I lowered it. The shadow followed. I laughed nervously and told myself I was tired. Then I started walking again. My shadow moved with me for a few seconds before suddenly speeding up. I watched the dark shape slide farther and farther ahead of me. It crossed the next street before I did. Then it reached the corner and disappeared around it. I stood there staring at the empty pavement. There was no light behind me strong enough to create such a long shadow. I turned around. The streetlight above me flickered once. When I looked forward again, my shadow was back at my feet. I continued walking, trying not to think about it. But every few seconds I glanced down. My shadow looked normal. It copied every movement perfectly. When I reached the next block, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The shadow had already reached my apartment building. It stretched across the entrance and seemed to be standing there, waiting. I was still nearly 200 feet away. I stopped beneath another streetlight, and the shadow vanished. Then I walked forward. With every step, it appeared farther ahead. By the time I reached the building, there was nothing unusual. The entrance looked exactly as it always did. I unlocked the door and went upstairs. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. I turned on the lights, locked the door, and checked the windows. Nothing was wrong. I made coffee and tried to forget what had happened. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. I barely slept. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke up because I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Slow footsteps. One step, pause, another step, pause. They stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath. Then I heard something drag across the floor. I waited several minutes before looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. But underneath the door, I could see a thin strip of darkness. It looked like someone's shadow was standing directly outside. I stepped away from the door and called the police, but before anyone answered, the darkness disappeared. When the officer arrived, he found nothing. He told me it was probably a neighbor walking around earlier. I didn't tell him about the shadow. I knew how ridiculous it sounded. The next morning I went to work and convinced myself the whole thing had been caused by exhaustion. But when I left that evening, I noticed something waiting on the sidewalk outside my office. My shadow. It was already stretched toward my home. This time, I didn't move. I stood under the office lights and watched it. The shadow slowly moved forward without me. It crossed the sidewalk, reached the parking lot, and continued toward the road. Then it stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Suddenly, it turned around. Not my body. The shadow itself turned around and faced me. I couldn't breathe. A shadow shouldn't have a face, but somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. Then it raised one hand and pointed toward my apartment. I ran home. When I reached my building, the front door was already open. I knew I had locked it that morning. I went inside and climbed the stairs. The hallway lights were off. At the end of the corridor, I could see a dark human shape standing outside my apartment. I froze. It looked exactly like me. Same height, same shoulders, same shape. but it wasn't attached to anyone. It was just a flat black silhouette standing against the wall. I backed away slowly. The shadow lifted its hand and knocked on my apartment door from the outside. 3 slow knocks. Then it pointed at me. I ran downstairs and spent the night at a hotel. For the next week, I avoided walking home after dark. I stayed with friends, changed my routine, and stopped looking at reflective windows. Everything seemed normal during daylight. But strange things began happening around my apartment. My bedroom light would turn on by itself. My curtains moved when the windows were closed. And every morning, I found dark footprints leading from my front door to the hallway. The footprints always stopped at the stairs. Then one night, I made the mistake of coming home early. The sun had already gone down, but there were still streetlights on. As I approached my building, I saw my shadow standing in front of the entrance. I was 20 feet away. It wasn't moving. It was simply waiting. I stopped. The shadow slowly raised its hand and pointed behind me. I turned around. There was nothing there. When I looked back, the shadow was gone. I rushed inside and locked the door. For several minutes I stood in the darkness, listening to my own breathing. Then I heard footsteps above me. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. The footsteps were coming from inside my apartment. I slowly climbed the stairs. The door was still locked. I opened it. Every light inside was on. And there, in the middle of my living room, was my shadow. It was standing completely upright on the floor, even though there was nothing casting it. I couldn't move. Then it began walking toward me. I stepped backward. It stepped forward. I stepped back again. It kept coming. Finally, I ran. I didn't look behind me until I reached the street. When I did, I saw the shadow standing in the doorway of my apartment. It raised its hand and waved. Then the strangest thing happened. The shadow turned around and walked deeper into my apartment. I never went back. I moved to another city 2 months later. I found a new apartment, changed my phone number, and tried to forget everything. For a while, it worked. I started sleeping normally again. I stopped checking the ground whenever I walked outside. Then, 3 weeks ago, I was walking home from work. The sun was setting behind me. I noticed my shadow stretching across the sidewalk. At first it moved normally. Then it stepped forward. I stopped. It kept walking. It crossed the street before I did. It reached my new apartment building and disappeared through the front door. I stood there frozen, staring at the empty sidewalk. My phone suddenly vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. There was only one sentence. "I'm home. You should hurry." I looked toward my apartment. Every light inside was on, and from the 3rd floor window, I could see a dark silhouette standing behind the curtains. It was shaped exactly like me. But this time, it wasn't waiting for me to come home. It was waiting for me to come inside.